Hello and welcome. I'm Ijoma Onyato. Tonight, new dawn in Zimbabwe as the country's military takes control of government, insists action is not a coup d'etat, but only to flush criminals out of the system. President Buhari asked Zimbabwe's military to respect the country's constitution as the other world leaders call for calm following change of power in the country. President Buhari orders the Inspector General of Police to restore Governor Obiano's security aids as Senate condemns action by the IGP, Ibrahim Idris. And at least 14 people killed as flash floods caused by heavy rain hit central Greece.
On Business News tonight, Fitch gives initial B+ rating to Nigeria's upcoming dollar-denominated Eurobond.
On sports news tonight, South Africa is shocked by the loss of the 2023 Rugby World Cup hosting rights to France.
And from Abuja, President Buhari leads APC's final campaign ahead of Saturday's governorship election in Anambra State, seeks support for the party's candidate, Tony Mugabe.
We begin from Zimbabwe, where the military today announced the takeover of power from Africa's oldest-serving president, Robert Mugabe. But they insist it's not a coup, but a move to reposition the country's political climate. Earlier in the day, the army blocked off major roads and announced on Zimbabwe Broadcasting Corporation TV that they have seized power. Our foreign affairs correspondent, Amarachi Ubani, reports.
It all began with armored tanks rolling into the capital, Harare, but not disturbing the peace. On Monday, Army Chief General Constantino Chiwenga warned the ruling ZANU-PF that it was ready to act to end a purge of supporters of sacked Vice President Emerson Mnangagwa last week. That statement, though condemned by the party's leadership, seemed to be the trigger for what happened this morning. In a short broadcast on national television, military spokesperson Major General Sibusiso Moyo said normalcy was expected to return as soon as the military had completed its mission.
To the generality of the people of Zimbabwe, we urge you to remain calm and limit unnecessary movement. However, we encourage those who are employed and those with essential business in the city to continue their normal activities as usual. Our wish is that you enjoy your rights and freedoms, and that we return our country to a dispensation that allows for investment, development, and prosperity that we all fought for and for which many of our citizens paid the supreme sacrifice.
No word has been heard from Mugabe or his wife, but some analysts say it may be the end of what has come to be known as the Mugabe era in Zimbabwe, and Africa will need to move on without him.
He has respect among the military authorities, and so I think that they will just find a soft landing for him.
And while there have been calls for calm and dialogue on all sides, there's been no condemnation of the military's action, begging the question whether military action was the only option for change in Zimbabwe. Amarachi Ubani, Channel Television News.
Meanwhile, the president is calling for calm, peace and respect for Zimbabwe's constitution as global reactions trail the military takeover of the government in that country. President Muhammadu Buhari wants all political and military stakeholders in Zimbabwe to avoid any action that may plunge the country into conflict. A statement by the president's spokesperson, Femi Adesina, quotes the president saying, "Every attempt must be made to resolve all contentious issues by constitutional means in Zimbabwe to save the country from avoidable political instability." End of quote. The military leadership in Zimbabwe is claiming that the rising political tension in the country is responsible for their takeover, especially in the aftermath of President Mugabe's removal of his vice president, Emerson Mnangagwa. Now, leaders around the world have been calling for calm in dealing with Zimbabwe's political situation. The African Union Commission released a statement earlier calling for the crisis to be resolved in a manner that promotes democracy and human rights and the socio-economic development of the country as well. The UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, has also appealed for calm and restraint. Meanwhile, as promised by President Jacob Zuma earlier today, South African envoys have arrived in Zimbabwe on behalf of the intergovernmental South African development community to speak to both sides of the crisis. This was confirmed by Mr. Zuma's spokesman, who says they've been received in Zimbabwe. The president has also said he hoped there would not be any unconstitutional change of government in the country following the military takeover.
I am hoping that the defense force will not move and do more damage, that they will be able to respect the constitution of Zimbabwe as well as the people of Zimbabwe.
And British Prime Minister Theresa May called on all sides to show restraint as the situation remains fluid.
Raises an important point, as we've all seen what has been taking place in Harare. We are monitoring those developments very carefully. The situation is still fluid, and we would urge restraint on all sides because we want to see and we would call for an avoidance of violence. Of course, our primary concern is the safety of British nationals in Zimbabwe, and that are obviously in an uncertain political situation. We do see reports of unusual military activity, so we would recommend British nationals in Harare to remain safely at home until the situation becomes clearer.
China, on the other hand, which has huge investment in Zimbabwe, says it's closely monitoring the situation and hopes that relevant parties can properly handle their internal affairs. China and Zimbabwe have a close diplomatic and economic relationship, and Beijing has stood with Mugabe's government in the face of Western economic sanctions. Robert Mugabe has been in power for 37 years, becoming a symbol of sit-tight leadership on the continent. This report looks back on the political history of one of the world's longest-serving and most controversial leaders.
7 years under President Robert Mugabe, Zimbabwe's military has seized control of the country, but denies it is staging a coup. Hours after armored vehicles were spotted closing in on the capital, Harare, soldiers stormed the state broadcaster early on Wednesday, broadcasting live a message to the nation.
Firstly, we wish to assure the nation that His Excellency the President of the Republic of Zimbabwe and Commander
Robert Mugabe was born on the 21st of February 1924. He has been president of Zimbabwe since 1987, after the independence from Britain. He previously led Zimbabwe as prime minister from 1980 to 1987. He chaired the Zimbabwe African National Union group from 1975 to 1980 and has led its successor political party, the ZANU Patriotic Front, since 1980. Mugabe was born to a poor Shona family in Kutama, southern Rhodesia. He was arrested for making anti-government comments and then convicted of sedition and imprisoned between 1964 and 1974. On release, he fled to Mozambique, established his leadership of ZANU, and oversaw ZANU's role in the Rhodesian Bush War, fighting Ian Smith's predominantly white government. He reluctantly took part in the peace negotiations brokered by the United Kingdom that resulted in the Lancaster House Agreement. That agreement dismantled white minority rule and resulted in the 1980 general election, at which Mugabe led the ZANU-PF party to victory, and he became prime minister of the newly renamed Zimbabwe. Having dominated Zimbabwe's politics for nearly 4 decades, Mugabe has been a controversial and divisive figure. He's been praised as a revolutionary hero of the African liberation struggle, who helped to free Zimbabwe from British colonialism, imperialism, and white minority rule. Conversely, he's been derided as a dictator, responsible for economic mismanagement, widespread corruption, anti-white racial discrimination, human rights abuses, suppression of political critics, and crimes against humanity.
To discuss developments in Zimbabwe and its implications for the stability of the region, I'm now being joined on the news at 10 by the former Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Joe Keshi from Abuja. Thanks a lot for joining us on the news at 10.
Thank you for having me. Good evening.
Well, good evening. How do you describe what transpired today? In your assessment, was it a coup or not?
That's a very interesting question. But the popular saying that if it talks like a dog, walk like a dog, and sing like a dog, it's a dog. What has happened in Zimbabwe has all the characteristics of a coup, not just in the making, but a successful coup. When the military occupies the airport, occupies the broadcasting stations, surrounds the president's house, what else is left? They've virtually taken over the country. And I think this is what we've seen. But I also suspect that the military leadership, they're also playing a very clever or very intelligent game in order not to invoke international condemnation and reprisals. They've decided to say that this is not a coup, but a way of resolving some of the crises that has engulfed the nation in the last couple of days.
Well, what the military...
So I think whether you look at it as a coup or not a coup, the fact is that we are witnessing the end of the Mugabe regime.
Well, what they're saying is that they're trying to rid the country and the president of the criminals around him. Those are the words they use. Now, are they actually taking charge of Zimbabwe's political future, or could this be a bigger problem down the line?
Well, it could be both. But from what we are saying today, look, for the past 24 hours, we've not heard the president. The military has virtually been in control of the country itself. And there are talks of forming an interim, national government. And a couple of names have been suggested to lead, the country, perhaps for a period of 5 years or for a few years and before a general election. So whatever be the case, again, I repeat that this is probably the end we've seen of Mugabe that has occupied the stage for 37 years.
Does it surprise you at all that no African leader, even let's look at their closest neighbor, South Africa, none of them have actually condemned what the military have done? Rather, they're calling for calm and saying there should be no unconstitutional change, but no outright condemnation of the military. Does that surprise you?
Not really. But again, you must understand that in spite of the shortcomings of Robert Mugabe, that there are quite a number of people around the continent and in Zimbabwe itself that have admiration and sympathy for the man as a revolutionary hero who fought for the independence of Zimbabwe. The second thing I think is that people are treating him out of respect, not only because of his age, but because of the role he's played in the country and in the liberation struggle all these years. And in saying that, one also regrets, that Mugabe would have seen the handwriting on the wall, and many years ago, perhaps taking that decision himself, to begin to create a group of successors and begin to plan his exit one way or the other. But now it's regrettable that he has to go this way, very shamefully. But in a situation where the old guard around him now feel that not just their position is strengthened by the desire of the wife to rule, the sacking of the popular, vice president who belongs to the old brigade, all these have precipitated the crisis. But we must hold the president himself fully responsible for what is happening in Zimbabwe today. It's not the criminals around him, but the president. He is the leader. He is expected to have the wisdom to know that at 89, he can certainly not continue and begin to make plans for a successful transition to a new regime.
All right, former Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Joe Keshi, thanks for joining us on the news at 10 tonight. In part 2, after break, over 10 people killed in bomb attack on Kondoga, Borno State, as troops repel attack and insurgents in Sebangeri, Adamawa State. Plus, lawmakers inspect federal courts here in Lagos, say condition under which judges work is deplorable. Do stay with us.